As I was working on this week's message and recognizing that we had talked about God breaking the limits of death on our lives, breaking the limits of sin, our sin on our lives, and that we were coming into this conversation now about how God would break the limits of time on our life, I really was praying about how I was going to begin to talk about that in a way that kind of was compelling, and this was one of those moments where I was still praying about kind of the finishing touches on the message even yesterday. I work on the message all week long, and really even before then, we plan these things out ahead of time and so forth, and I just wasn't finding a good kind of opener. And so yesterday when I went out to the air show in Kingsville, and did any of y'all go to that? Just me? Seth did. He was with me. Schaefer did. And maybe if you've been to that before, you've seen kind of the amazing things those pilots do with those aircraft that just absolutely seem to defy the principles of aerodynamics. I mean, they do things with those airplanes they're not supposed to do. I mean, I saw a propeller plane hover. I mean, that just doesn't happen. I mean, and I'm not talking about an Osprey. I mean, this was a, an old style propeller aircraft. And I mean, I just saw all kinds of amazing things, not the least of which was the Blue Angels. And it was amazing to behold what they were doing. And you may remember a couple of weeks ago, I talked about how one of my childhood heroes was Chuck Yeager, a pilot, a test pilot. And, as a kid, that just seems so cool. And, of course, that's one of those things when you're, as a child, you just go, I want to be that when I grow up. Of course, Mom wasn't near as keen on the idea when I said that. But then I realized as I was watching these airplanes do these amazing things, the clocks run out on that childhood dream. I was listening to, they would talk about over the PA system, they would talk about the biographies, short little synopsis of where these guys had come from and how they got into flying and so forth. And most of them had been flying for a long, long time. Actually, all of them had been flying for a long time. And every single one of them had made the decision to get into aviation at an age much younger than what I am now. Okay? The clocks run out. I can't be a test pilot or a stunt pilot. That's just not going to happen. That limit of time, that the ship has sailed on that one. As we think about these childhood dreams, I'm not going to be an astronaut either. That was another one of them, said, I want to be that when I grow up. I'm not going to be the first guy to set foot on Mars, although, these days I'm going, West Texas is even kind of tough for me these days. So, I'm not sure I would want to go into a climate like that. But I'm not going to be the richest man in the world. I think I said that as a kid, too. There's all kinds of things that I said when I was a kid that I wanted to do when I grow up. That just really aren't possibilities anymore. The clock has run out on those things. I'm moving in a different direction. And at that age, the things that I'm talking about, those things were possible. I mean, we do those things. I mean, we haven't had a guy set foot on Mars yet, but they're talking about the plans, and that's another thing. Now they're talking about when they go there, maybe they're not coming back. Good. I'm glad I didn't head down that road, right? Those things, those possibilities, those are all things which, though remote in possibility, they are still possibilities. For someone who's a child right now, might grow up to do one of those things. I mean, we live in an amazing culture, an amazing world, an amazing country where people born in the humblest of circumstances can achieve great things in any number of fields. Many of those things were possible when I was a child because at that point, my whole life was still out before me. And all those commitments and priorities that come into our lives hadn't pushed them out. There was still all the time in the world, and the world was full of possibilities. That's one of the real blessings of childhood. Anything's possible. But as we get older, as we mature, we begin to make choices by necessity. We have to do this, and it's a good thing that we do this. We make choices to head in certain directions, choices that impact the trajectory of our lives, that bring our lives into clear focus as to how things are going to turn out. Even if we try not to make choices, those refusals are in fact choices in and of themselves. There's a line from an old Rush song that I used to listen to called Free Will. If you choose not to decide, you've still made a choice. And that is absolutely true. Not that I'm saying go listen to Rush for all the truth in the world, okay? That's not what I'm saying. But even not making a choice is a choice in and of itself. It's not like we can stop the passage of time by refusing to make decisions, even if we act sometimes like we do. You know, how many of us have heard the phrase, oh, grow up. Get some direction. It's right that we make choices, that we narrow our focus, that we don't simply put those decisions off as though time is not ticking away. When it comes to the nature of time, how much of it we get, and how our plans work out in regard to that time, one of the best places, one of the best pictures I've seen, at least one of the most powerful pictures, even if it challenges us a little bit, one of the most powerful pictures that I found in Scripture is in the 90th Psalm. So I want to encourage you now to open your Bibles with me to Psalm 90, or follow along on the screen if you so desire. Read along on your mobile device, whatever the case may be. But read along with me in the 90th Psalm. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You return man to dust, and say, return, O children of man. For 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday when it is past, or as a watch in the night. You sweep them away as with a flood. They're like a dream, like grass that is renewed in the morning. In the morning it flourishes and is renewed. In the evening it fades and withers. For we are brought to an end by your anger. By your wrath we are dismayed. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. For all our days pass away under your wrath. We bring our years to an end like a sigh. The years of our life are 70, or by reason of strength, 80. But their span is but toil and trouble. They are soon gone, we fly away. Who considers the power of your anger and your wrath according to the fear of you? So teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom. Return, O Lord, how long? Have pity on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, that we may be rejoicing and glad all our days. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, and for as many years as we have seen evil. Let your work be shown to your servants, and your glorious power to their children, and establish the work of your hands, a work of our hands upon us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. It's interesting that that's where that psalm ends, and it repeats that line. Establish the work of our hands. Not bless, O Lord, whatever we try to do, no matter what it is. Bless our desires, no matter what they are. Instead, God asserts through this psalm that he doesn't simply bless our lives, whatever it is we do, as much as he leads us to a path that he has established, and encourages us to move down that path, or at least to find that path and begin taking the journey. Or maybe another way to think about it is like a foundation. God builds for us a foundation and encourages us to, as we said in a previous series, build our house on that foundation. And if we go off over here into another place and start building on ground that's not as solid, then we find that our work is not blessed as much as it might be, or that the work is eventually brought to nothing. So God doesn't simply bless us in whatever it is that we want to do, but instead God establishes for us work to do in which we will then be blessed. For me, regarding those childhood dreams and finding what it was that I was supposed to do for the rest of my life, it basically at first amounted to wandering aimlessly through various different educational and career choices, until God finally got my attention and directed me into a career path, a calling that would become the purposeful priority of my life. And I have to say, in light of the amazing possibilities of those childhood dreams, it really doesn't bother me these days that there's not enough time left on my clock to pursue possibilities like being a stunt pilot. I'm okay that ship has sailed because I've recognized that God has given me a purpose and has established a place for me to do my work and a ministry in which to do my work. So I'm okay with the fact that our time here is limited. And that's my first point for this morning. Our time here is limited. Think about it like this. We sort of put these expectations on our lives. We kind of have, we mentally seem to know intellectually on some level that there's a limit to our days. And kind of like the psalmist said, 70, 80 years, somewhere within the average lifespan, right? Of course, there are a few, like the 8:30 service, I had somebody come up to me and say, I just had my 79th birthday. 80's coming. So when you said that, I was wondering if I might get a little more out of it. Okay, yeah, we were looking at averages, and even apparently in the days of the psalmist, 70, 80 years was kind of a reasonable expectation out of what we think life is going to be. And so when we're younger, we think, yeah, we've got all this time up to that time when we hit 70 or 80 or somewhere in there. When we leave our house in the mornings, we expect to return that afternoon or evening. We go on a business trip or vacation. We expect to go to a different place, do whatever it was we were going to do there, and that we're just going to come back home at the end of those days and go back to our routine. We don't expect tragic car accidents, becoming the victim of violence or terrorism, or even becoming the victim of our own mistakes, where maybe we've made a mistake that ended up being fatal for us or for those around us. Or maybe it's just simply sudden traumatic health events like heart attacks, natural disasters. Those things, even though we don't expect them, though we don't plan for them, we know that they happen every day. None of us really knows the end of our days. Some people get warnings, but most of us probably don't want to have that extended, protracted illness where we know we've got 6 months to live, a year to live, a couple of years to live. Those have their own difficulties and their own limits on them. So really and truly, even in light of those possibilities, we don't know how many days we get. So I think when the psalmist says, "Teach us, Lord, to number our days," he's not saying, "Lord, help us figure out exactly how much time we have here." He's saying, "Help us, Lord, to understand that there is a limit to our days, even if we don't know what it is." James chapter 4, verses 13 through 15 puts it like this. "Come now," James says, "you who say, 'Today or tomorrow we'll go into such and such a town, spend a year there, make a trade and a profit,' yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you're a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, 'If the Lord wills, we will live and do this and that.'" James is recognizing here not just that we don't know where we're going to go or what God's going to allow us to do. He's even saying before that, he says, "If the Lord wills, we will live." James is recognizing there's a number to our days, and we don't have that number, God does. So we need to come to an understanding that we really don't know how much time we have here, what God's going to do with us during that time. We also need to come to understand our time belongs to God. Our time belongs to God. That's my second point for this morning. Our time belongs to God. We tend to think of our time as our time, our own. We think of our plans as our plans. But really and truly, if everything we have and everything we are and all of the world around us was created by God, then does anything really belong to us? We get frustrated when our plans get interrupted and we still think of them as our plans. We like people to honor our time, right? If someone's late for an appointment with me, what's the first thing I start thinking? Well, they don't think very much of my time. Whose time? Say we get delayed on a busy day. We're in traffic, on our way to work, and there's a car accident up ahead. Oh, once again, I'm going to be late to work. How am I going to explain this to my boss? I've been late 2 times this week. Are they really going to believe me when I say there was, an accident on SPID, whatever the case may be? Then we don't stop to consider the tragedy that may have unfolded up ahead of us on the roadway. Our plans get interrupted. Sometimes they get interrupted because there's something God's doing. Maybe we get delayed on a busy day because someone needs our help, and we just can't pass by and not help them. Retirement plans, don't get me wrong, I think it's prudent and wise for us to plan for retirement, to do our very best to make sure that we're going to have the resources we need when we stop doing our professional work. Or maybe so that something will set us free to do us what we know God's really calling us to do. I mean, sometimes that's what folks do with their retirement. That's wonderful. But those plans get interrupted. Emergencies happen in our lives, and I don't know if you've noticed this, but emergencies are expensive. That seems to be part of the definition. When there's an emergency in your life, it's going to cost a lot of money, especially when it involves a health situation. Or maybe someone in your life gets in trouble and they come to you for help, and you have an opportunity to be God's presence in their life. A family member has an unexpected crisis, or maybe it's that family member who you just knew this crisis was coming, but they weren't listening to anybody, and you still have to be available to them in a kind of way that doesn't enable them to continue in that direction, but still you have to be available for them. It interrupts your life, changes the course and direction of things. Or let's face it, this is an election year, and politicians mess up the economy. Business leaders make mistakes. Maybe the business leader who leads your organization and has caused a loss of a job or something like that. Some politicians make a decision, the economy gets tanked, and next thing we know, we're having to look for another line of work. I mean, I couldn't help but think of politicians, and it killed me that while we were at the 8:30 service, we were singing, "It is well with my soul," and there's that line in it about, "Then the trump shall resound," and I couldn't help but think, and I was trying to, push that image out of my mind. I want to think about what the song really means, right? Sometimes we pay the price for what other people have done, and that interrupts our lives. Proverbs chapter 16, verse 9 puts it like this: "The heart of a man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps." I just love how that matches up with what the Psalm said this morning too, by the way. The Lord establishes our plans. The Lord establishes the work of our hands, or we're praying, "Lord, establish the work of our hands," and the Lord establishes our steps. So in other words, we have our plans, we do our things. Sometimes there's success in those plans, even when it's a plan we've come up with all by ourselves, but then we have to realize at some point that it is God who is enabling us to move forward, that it's God who's enabling us to do this work. They're really not our plans. Instead, God has plans that He's established for us. It's really more of a question of whether or not our will matches up with God's will, and whether or not we're willing for Him to rearrange our time and our schedule to make some divine appointments in our lives. We need to learn how to perceive every interaction in our lives with others, and not just interactions with others, even our alone time, as divine appointments in which God has a purpose for what's going on. Whether it's colleagues in our workplace, maybe even an unexpected delay in an important project. Maybe it's work with our fellow students or with our teachers. Even those can be divine appointments. Interactions with our family members, the neighbor across the street, or even those chance encounters that just don't seem to have much weight and importance to them at all. Standing in line, waiting to pay for whatever item it is you picked up at whatever retail establishment it is where you've gone. That even that encounter with that clerk at the register is a divine appointment where God can be interacting with you and with that person in a powerful way if we're ready to receive it. if we're ready to be a part of it. And so we need to ask ourselves, what is God trying to do in this moment, in every given moment? The scriptures tell us to pray without ceasing, and I think that's part of what it means, is bringing us into an understanding that God's activity is constantly working in our lives and through our lives. And because of that, third and finally this morning, God transcends the limits of time. God transcends the limits of time. The opening verses of both the Gospel according to John and the book of Genesis, that first book in the Bible, point to that reality. And our psalm this morning points to it as well. From everlasting to everlasting. So in other words, from time before time until time after time, God is. He always was and He always will be. John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and begins to direct us toward what we've come to understand scripturally and theologically, that God exists in a triune form and has always existed as such. That yes, there's one God, but in that God are revealed three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And that's the way it's always been. And that's the way it always will be. So when it comes to the philosophical question, if God created everything, who created God? There is no answer to that question because God never was created. And God will never be destroyed. So God transcends the limits of time. God in His eternalness, His eternality maybe is a better word, understands time differently than you and I do. We're born at a particular point in time, and we know that our life on earth is going to end sometime out here. We have a limited amount of time. We have numbered days. 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 8 and 9, Peter puts it like this to the early church. He says, "But do not overlook this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord, one day is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is a day. The Lord is not slow to fulfill His promises, as some count slowness, but is patient toward you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance." You see, we get impatient. And sometimes we pray impatiently for patience, right? Lord, give me patience and give it to me right now. Here's the problem. He's going to answer that prayer by making you wait. That doesn't mean don't pray for patience, okay? I mean, it'd be easy to say that because, well, if you pray for patience, God's going to make you wait to build in you the kind of character that has patience. But even if you don't pray for it, sometimes God puts that character in you and makes you wait anyway. We get impatient because we think God is slow in fulfilling His promises, but we're talking about a God who existed before all time and will exist forever. And our lives, the psalm tells us, is like a mist that vanishes according to His way of reckoning things. So when God's promises seem slow in being fulfilled, it may not be God is slow as much as it is an act of grace, because God, even though while we're praying for patience and we lack it, God has patience. And He's patient with us even when we're impatient with Him. It may be more that God is waiting for us rather than that we're waiting for Him to fulfill His promise. Because God's not willing that any should perish. He's going to give us as many chances as He possibly can. That doesn't mean forever, though. There's a limit to God's patience. So since that patience isn't endless, if He's speaking to your heart, don't put it off another moment longer. Whatever it is, whether He's calling you to a particular ministry, whether He's calling for a change in your life, whether He's calling for you to put down a particular sin, or maybe He's calling you to follow Him for the first time ever that you're aware of. Maybe He's been calling you, but now's the time when you're listening. Don't put that off for another moment longer. Respond to the invitation. You know, God also works with those who think it's too late. Because too many years have passed. The clock's run out on that dream. I mean, think about Abraham and Sarah, when God first begins working with them, their names are Abram and Sarai. And God comes to them, and they're advanced in years. They're past that 70 or 80 we were talking about in the psalm earlier. They're way up there in years. And God approaches them and says, "You're going to have a child." And Sarah has that reaction. She laughs. And God says, "I heard you laugh. But mark my words. You're going to have a child, and that child's going to be the father of many nations. Through that child, all the earth will be blessed." Now, that didn't mean, bam, it happened next week. In fact, they had to continue to wait, and it tried their patience to the point they began to help God. By the way, that saying, God helps those who help themselves, that is not a Bible passage, okay? In fact, that'll get you in trouble sometimes, and it got Abram and Sarah in trouble. Because they decided to, you can read the story later, it's in Genesis. Genesis is one of those books where you just get people in there. It doesn't mean everything that happened in Genesis was God blessing it. God's blessing them in spite of the fact that they're doing these things. And they go and they try to help God in his plan. They try to devise another plan so that they will have children, and that goes very badly. And in many ways, you might argue that we're still dealing with the consequences of that decision. But God didn't break off the promise from them based on that. God still worked out the promise he had made to them, and they had to be patient, and they had to wait for it, even though they didn't wait for it. And they weren't too far gone. So there was two things working against them according to our ways of understanding things. One, they were really old, and the time seemed like it was almost up for them. And two, the other thing is that they messed up the plan. Maybe some of us think it's too late for God to use us. Maybe we think we're just too old. There's nothing left. Or maybe we've messed up the situation so badly we don't think there's any way it can possibly be redeemed. Brothers and sisters, I'm here to tell you the Bible is full, and history of the world is full of people that God has used not only in spite of their sin, but has taken those sinful situations and redeemed them in such a way that no one except someone who has gone through those circumstances could possibly speak to others in the way that they can. So it's not too late for you. God still has a plan and a purpose for you. Even if you're in a situation that you think you've messed up too badly for God to use, God has a way of redeeming it and even leveraging it for his plan and purposes. I know I told you earlier in the message that I wandered through various different career fields because I was not listening to God. In many ways, I was running away from God, and yet God took the experiences and the things I learned along the way, and every single situation has a way of applying into the ministry in which I now find myself. By God's grace. He redeemed it. Main point for this morning is spend your time following God's will. And don't waste your time on things that keep you from it. Even if you think you've pushed yourself too far out of God's plan, it's never too late to be turned around by God. Remember the test I shared with you several months ago when I said, if you're wondering if God's calling you, there's a special test to help you figure it out. You get a mirror, you hold it really close to your face, and if it fogs up, God is calling you. That is absolutely true. If there's still life in our veins and breath in our lungs, God still has a plan and a purpose for us. Thanks to the fact that Jesus has conquered both death and sin, as we've talked about in the last couple of weeks, we know now that time on the other side of death stretches out eternally for those who love and trust Jesus, for those who follow Jesus. That limit on our lives has been absolutely blown away. It's like the last lines of that verse from Amazing Grace, that last verse of Amazing Grace. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright, shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. Think about the math there. Infinity minus 10,000 is still infinity. In the light of eternity, the limits of time slip away. They fade into obscurity. But we do have an opportunity in this temporal life to make a difference both here and now, but also for eternity. If we recognize those interactions with others and that time alone with God as divine appointments, we have the opportunity to make a difference in our life and in the lives of those around us that begins now and lasts forever. Don't let those opportunities slip away. Be willing to endure, even if necessary, a little difficulty for now, as it will fade into insignificance in the course of forever.